Hey guys, tonight we begin our gentle descent into humanity's oldest mistake, and perhaps its most beloved companion, alcohol. Long before skyscrapers, smartphones, or the concept of moderation, people were already inventing new ways to regret their evenings. Before we start, you can, if you feel so inclined, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy being lulled to sleep by bad decisions disguised as history. And, as always, let me know where you're listening from. I never cease to be amazed by how many time zones people choose to be sleepy and dot now. Dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that comforting hum of domestic stillness, and let's wander back in time together to when humanity first decided that fermentation probably meant a good idea. It all started somewhere around 7000 BCE in Neolithic China. A farmer, possibly distracted, possibly lazy, left a mixture of rice, honey, and fruit sitting out too long. As with most neglected things, it began to bubble ominously, a potion equal parts curiosity and poor judgment. At some point, an early human, driven either by hunger or optimism, decided to drink it. That was it. The moment human history truly began. Forget fire. Forget the wheel. The real dawn of civilization was someone staring at a suspicious jar of spoiled fruit and saying, "You know what? Why not?" The first taste must have been confusing. The second probably life-changing. By the third, our prehistoric pioneer was having an emotional conversation with a rock. The stars spun, the ground wobbled, and everything suddenly seemed profound. They had discovered not just alcohol, but the ability to ruin tomorrow today. 5 hours later, of course, came the second discovery, regret. The first hangover in recorded, or rather, pre-recorded history. Archaeologists later found pottery jars at the site of Jehu, still stained with that ancient brew. Rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. The world's earliest cocktail. The prehistoric equivalent of whatever's left in the fridge. And once people realized drinking it didn't immediately kill them, they did what humans always do. They made it a tradition. Soon, getting drunk wasn't an accident anymore. It was an event. The first toast, the first argument, the first terrible singing performance. All born in that muddy village thousands of years ago. Humanity had officially found its coping mechanism. A brief escape from reality. Long before there were taxes, wars, or neighbors to complain about. Thousands of years later, in Mesopotamia, humans took things further. Around 4000 BCE, while nature evolved toward survival, we invented beer, and only then thought, maybe we should figure out food. Double quotes, yes, beer came before bread. People were brewing barley long before they learned to bake it. Clay tablets from summer shell, men drinking from shared vats through long straws. Because even then, nobody wanted other people's germs. These weren't dainty cups. Imagine a group of serious adults crouched around a muddy bowl, sipping quietly, pretending it's a spiritual experience. That was the first happy hour in human history. And because humans love organizing chaos, the Sumerians even had a goddess of beer named Kasi. Her hymn, which conveniently doubles as the earliest surviving recipe, is basically the world's first homebrew guide. Civilization, it turns out, began not with philosophy, but with a tipsy choir worshipping a divine bartender. Beer wasn't indulgence, it was infrastructure. Water in Mesopotamia wasn't exactly trustworthy. Drinking it raw was a health experiment you usually lost. But beer, brewed and fermented, was boiled, filtered, and safer. It was hydration, nutrition, and entertainment all in one clay mug. Daily rations included beer for everyone. Workers, priests, even children. It wasn't golden and bubbly like today's lagers, but thick and sweet, full of floating barley bits. Archaeologists describe it as nutrient-dense. Translation: warm alcoholic oatmeal. And yet, this murky porridge powered the earliest cities. People farmed, built temples, and wrote cuneiform tablets while mildly drunk, which may explain why half of early Sumerian laws sound like they were written by someone on their fourth cup. So yes, beer built civilization. Not reason, not logic, not ambition. Just farmers who decided that mild intoxication was the best way to handle existence. If Mesopotamia invented beer, Egypt perfected it. By 3000 BCE, Egyptians had turned drinking into a daily ritual. Beer wasn't luxury. It was breakfast. It appeared at every occasion: labor wages, temple offerings, funerals, and probably school lunches. You could, theoretically, live your entire life on a diet of bread, onions, and beer, and many did. It explains why ancient Egyptian art mostly shows people looking both busy and vaguely tired. For the poor, beer was thick, cheap, and sweetened with dates, poured into clay jars that hadn't seen soap since the reign of the last pharaoh. Still, it was cleaner than the Nile, which came with complementary parasites. And so humanity continued, fueled by yeast and bad decisions, slowly staggering its way into civilization. By the time Egypt hit its stride, humanity had perfected the art of being productively tipsy. The average laborer, archaeologists say, drank somewhere between 2 and 3 liters of beer each day, which means half of the pyramids were built by people working in a pleasantly fuzzy state of mind. Even the children joined in, not out of rebellion, but out of practicality. In a land where the water might introduce you to your ancestors prematurely, beer for breakfast was the sensible choice. Parents would hand their kids small clay cups filled with thick, sweet brew and send them off to lessons in writing and arithmetic. And truly, it explains a lot. One can't help but suspect that geometry was invented by a civilization that, for a few hours each morning, saw double. Meanwhile, the elites, those spared from lifting anything heavier than a thought-preferred wine, the official drink of leisure, pharaohs imported it from faraway lands like Syria and Greece. Storing it in painted jars and sipping it as if fermented grapes were a mark of wisdom, rather than an accident in a vineyard. Cleopatra, naturally, had her own private vineyard. Ruling Egypt, it seems, required both diplomacy and a dependable cabernet. Temples brewed beer on an almost industrial scale. Workers who dragged stone blocks for the pyramids were paid not in gold or glory, but in daily rations of bread and beer. In other words, one of the 7 wonders of the world was fueled almost entirely by carbohydrates and mild intoxication. Even eternity wasn't exempt. Tomb paintings show the deceased reclining comfortably as servants poured beer into jars for them, ensuring that, in the afterlife, thirst and sobriety would remain equally distant memories. Egypt may have given the world papyrus, the calendar, and divine kingship, but it also left us with something deeply human: the knowledge that life feels easier when slightly out of focus. While Egyptians were essentially drinking bread smoothies, the early Chinese were perfecting something far more deliberate, or at least pretending to. Around 3000 BCE, in the fertile valleys of the Yellow River, brewers were fermenting rice, millet, and fruit into drinks that actually tasted like intention. Archaeologists have unearthed elegant bronze vessels still coated with traces of ancient wine, proof that by this point, the global pastime of turning food into regret had officially gone international. Unlike most cultures that stumbled upon fermentation by mistake, the Chinese treated it like sacred chemistry. Alcohol wasn't an accident. It was divine communication, a shimmering bridge between mortals and their ancestors, poetic in theory, until someone inevitably crossed it too many times and fell asleep in a rice paddy. Drinking became a spiritual performance. Nobles and kings held elaborate ceremonies where wine was first poured in honor of the spirits, then swiftly in honor of themselves just to verify its holiness. Ancient records even mention officials who lost their positions for showing up too sober. In short, being moderate wasn't just dull, it was dangerous. By the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, court life resembled an endless, well-funded tasting session. Ornate goblets shaped like animals, musicians humming drinking songs, scholars offering toasts that started as philosophy and ended as slurred poetry. Eventually, the government had to issue what might be history's first drink responsibly notice, realizing that paperwork goes unfinished when half your ministers are asleep under the table. Still, wine remains sacred, the water of life, early poets called it. It inspired music, calligraphy, and those profound-sounding essays that stopped making sense after the third cup. Even Confucius, the philosopher of restraint, advised moderation in a tone that sounded suspiciously like regret. So, while much of the world was still struggling to keep its beer from exploding, China had already turned drinking into an art form, structured, ceremonial, and just chaotic enough to feel divine. Civilization, it turns out, truly begins when intoxication learns manners. Meanwhile, back in Mesopotamia around 2700 BCE, alcohol was no longer just a drink. It was a plot device. The world's first surviving story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like an ancient moral about friendship, mortality, and the hazards of drinking outside your comfort zone. It introduces Enkidu, a wild man who lived with animals until he was lured towards civilization. With two irresistible inventions, bread and beer, his first sip turned him human, or at least, human enough to regret things. The Sumerians didn't think alcohol corrupted man. They thought it completed him. Somewhere out there, a modern philosopher is still trying to prove them right with significantly less success. In Mesopotamia, drinking wasn't only social, it was spiritual. Temples doubled as breweries and priests moonlighted as bartenders. Offerings to the gods included freshly brewed beer, because as every civilization learns, it's easier to pray after a pint. Clay tablets reveal ancient recipes and hymns singing Kasi, the goddess of brewing. These holy songs read less like scripture and more like a cheerful pub chant. Praise the grain, stir the mash, and may your hangover be gentle. Beer was affectionately known as liquid bread, a phrase that turned fasting into virtue and happy art into holy practice. It was also practical. Fermentation preserved grain far longer than storage ever could. Laborers working on canals or temples were paid in beer rations, which meant that much of summer's infrastructure was built by pleasantly hydrated professionals. And as they sipped, civilization began to take shape. Contracts were written, laws recorded, labor divided. Somewhere between the fifth and sixth cup, the first bureaucrat was born, possibly asleep at his tablet. The result: humanity's first administration run entirely on barley. Priests blessed the barrels, accountants tallied the pints, and poets immortalized the feeling of a good buzz. Archaeologists have even found complaints carved into tablets from workers grumbling about weak beer, because if there's one thing older than civilization itself, it's bad customer service. The first recorded customer complaint in human history wasn't about taxes or rent. It was about beer, etched into a clay tablet roughly 4,000 years old. A disgruntled Sumerian left what is essentially the earliest Yelp review, lamenting the tragedy of watered-down ale. And so, while later philosophers would wrestle with the meaning of existence, Mesopotamia had already found its answer swirling at the bottom of a communal drinking pot. Their great epic didn't just celebrate gods and kings. It quietly acknowledged an eternal truth. No good story ever began with a salad. If the Mesopotamians drank to build civilization, and the Egyptians drank to worship their gods, then the Greeks drank to think, argue, and occasionally forget what they just thought or argued. By the 6th century BCE, Greece had turned drinking into an art form, a social ritual called the symposium, literally meaning to drink together. It sounds elegant, and often was, at least until it wasn't. Guests reclined on couches, servants poured wine, poets declaimed verses, and philosophers debated virtue until virtue itself became a little theoretical. The symposium wasn't chaos, it was organized chaos. There were rules, music, and one unlucky soul designated a symposiarch, the host in charge of watering down the wine so nobody tried to philosophize with the furniture. Greek wine was so potent that a Spartan could hug you after the cups, which, by Spartan standards, was practically a declaration of war. And yes, the Greeks always mixed their wine with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something uncivilized tribes might do before pillaging your coastline. To sip diluted wine was to be civilized. To refuse dilution was to be animal. Ironically, most symposiums still ended with someone crying, someone singing, and someone waking up next to a broken lyre. The gods themselves didn't abstain either. Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and poor impulse control, reigned as the divine patron of both theater and hangovers. His followers roamed the hills in ecstatic frenzy, shouting hymns, waving ivy crowns, and generally behaving like the world's first music festival. If Coachella had more goats and fewer safety regulations, to the Greeks, intoxication wasn't sin. It was revelation. Madness was divine, a temporary surrender that let mortals peek behind the curtain of logic. Even Plato, in his Symposium, described drinking as a metaphor for love and divine truth. One imagines Socrates, cup in hand, calmly insisting that virtue is knowledge while someone beside him is trying to remember where their sandals went. The Greeks, of course, also invented the first known hangover remedy, eating cabbage before drinking. It didn't help, but it did demonstrate humanity's eternal optimism in the face of predictable consequences. From these contradictions, logic and chaos, reason and wine, Western philosophy was born. Civilization had discovered an essential principle: deep thought is easier to endure when you can attribute it to the alcohol. Every culture had its party deity, but none rivaled Dionysus. While other gods handed down laws or lightning bolts, Dionysus arrived barefoot, wine jug in hand, whispering, "Let's feel something." His cult spread across the Mediterranean like spilled wine across marble. His followers, mostly women known as maenads, abandoned their homes to dance wildly in the mountains, their hair unbound, their cups overflowing. Under moonlight and intoxication, they sang, howled, and occasionally disassembled small animals, proving that spirituality and chaos often attend the same service. To outsiders, it was madness. To believers, transcendence. Drunkenness, they said, dissolved the boundaries between human and divine. Dionysus offered no commandments, only the promise that losing control could sometimes be holy. His festivals, the Dionysia, began as drunken parades and somehow evolved into the birth of Western theater. From those ecstatic gatherings came both tragedy and comedy, proof that all art is, at heart, a form of intoxication. Actors wore masks, choruses chanted praises, and playwrights competed for prizes while audiences maintained what scholars would politely call a steady level of immersion. But Dionysus was not merely chaos. His myths warned that denying joy was dangerous. King Pentheus, who banned his worship, learned this the hard way when the maenads, in a trance, mistook him for a lion. The lesson was clear: never stand between a Greek and their weekend plans. For the philosophers, Dionysus embodied the wild, instinctive side of humanity, the eternal counterpoint to Apollo, god of reason and light. Together, they represented the tension that defines civilization itself: order versus ecstasy, restraint versus surrender, the inner voice that says be responsible and the other that murmurs. Just one more. Through Dionysus, the Greeks understood creation and destruction, joy and ruin, the hangover and the enlightenment that follows it. Without Apollo, there would be no structure. Without Dionysus, no stories worth telling. And then came the Romans. The Greeks may have drunk for philosophy, but the Romans drank for everything else: politics, celebration, boredom, hygiene, despair. They industrialized intoxication. For them, wine wasn't merely a drink. It was infrastructure. In vino veritas, they said, in wine, there is truth. Which probably explains why Roman truths so often ended in coups, scandals, or new emperors. Wine flowed through Roman society like blood through veins. From the slums to the Senate, from farmhands to philosophers, everyone drank it. Soldiers, slaves, and senators alike were sustained by it. Military rations even included daily wine instead of water, which raises certain questions about the logistics of marching across Gaul. While cheerfully inebriated, the empire may have been built with iron and ambition, but it was held together by grapes and denial. A bold move, Caesar, truly. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer nations, it conquered the grape. Vineyards unfurled across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East like green veins of ambition. Roman vintners cultivated hundreds of varieties, none of which, by modern standards, could be called drinkable. Their wines were thick, acidic, and tasted like a dare someone lost. They mixed them with honey, herbs, seawater, or whatever distracted the tongue from realizing something had gone terribly wrong. Think less fine vintage, more fermented experiment. At Roman banquets, guests reclined on couches surrounded by silver cups, peacock feathers, and quiet dread. Servants poured endlessly, musicians strummed lyres, and self-proclaimed philosophers declared moral wisdom through slurred Latin. Wine wasn't about taste. It was about hierarchy. The wealthier the Roman, the stranger the ingredients. Caligula allegedly dissolved pearls into his goblet, a performance of opulence, or perhaps a convenient way to explain why everyone at dinner looked nervous. A few brave thinkers tried to oppose the flow. The Stoics preached moderation, claiming that self-control was the true path to wisdom. Unfortunately, most Stoics lived under Nero, which makes their occasional relapse into debauchery remarkably understandable. Public drunkenness wasn't condemned. It was practically civic engagement. Poets wrote odes to hangovers, emperors toasted their own reflections, and the gods, naturally, drank along. Bacchus, Rome's version of Dionysus, presided over festivities so wild that the Senate officially banned them, an act that predictably doubled their popularity overnight. Rome built aqueducts, armies, and philosophy, but its most enduring legacy might be the collective human instinct to pour another glass and say, "We'll fix it tomorrow." While the Greeks had intellectualized wine and the Romans industrialized it, the Persians did something more dangerous. They spiritualized it. In ancient Achaemenid Persia, kings hosted banquets vast enough to feed a small city and intoxicate a medium one. According to Herodotus, guests were expected to discuss politics while thoroughly inebriated, because the logic went, if a decision made drunk still sounded wise when sober, it must be truly sound. This worked surprisingly well until someone inevitably proposed invading Greece between dessert and dizziness. But Persia's greatest intoxication came centuries later, under the Islamic Golden Age, when alcohol became both forbidden and fascinating. The Quran banned it, yet poets couldn't stop writing about it. They called it the forbidden ruby, liquid wisdom, the nectar of the soul. It was the world's first great poetic loophole, intoxication by metaphor. No one wielded that contradiction like Omar Khayyam, the 11th century astronomer, mathematician, and part-time philosopher of hangovers. In his Rubaiyat, he turned wine into a symbol of fleeting joy and quiet rebellion. A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and now, he wrote, the ancient Persian equivalent of a date night whispered under house arrest. Persia's relationship with alcohol was a masterpiece of contradiction, public restraint, private indulgence. Officially sinful, socially irresistible. Aristocrats gathered in hidden gardens, surrounded by fountains and jasmine, raising their cups beneath the stars. They toasted to beauty, longing, and the peculiar hypocrisy of their own virtue. Physicians, ever practical, prescribed diluted wine for digestion and melancholy, proof that medical excuses are humanities. Most ancient art formed up by the time European travelers arrived. They were astonished to discover that Persia, a land officially dry, quietly produced some of the finest vintages on earth. The Persians didn't just drink to forget, they drank to remember beautifully. One hand wrote scripture, the other uncorked metaphor. And far to the north, where the climate was less forgiving and the sun barely a rumor, the so-called barbarians were making their own improvements to the human condition. The Celts, Germans, and Norse had little patience for philosophy or dilution ratios. Their solution to winter and existential dread was refreshingly direct: drink until neither mattered. The Greeks called them barbarians because they didn't water their wine. The barbarians called the Greeks boring. They brewed mead, fermented honey, and water, a drink fit for heroes, poets, and anyone still standing after their second horn. The Vikings believed it descended from the gods themselves, brewed from honey and poetry. Judging by the combination of war songs and axe throwing that followed, the recipe was alarmingly effective. The Celts brewed their own earthy beer in clay pots, seasoned with herbs instead of hops, and drank from communal bowls large enough to drown moderation. Toasts were shouted, verses sung, and next mornings profoundly regretted. To offer a guest drink was sacred hospitality, a ritual that continued until enlightenment or unconsciousness, whichever came first. Meanwhile, The Germans perfected ale so strong that Roman diplomats mention it with a caution, usually reserved for natural disasters. Tacitus wrote that the German tribes held drunken councils, meaning they made national decisions in the same condition. Most people agreed to regrettable tattoos. To the northern tribes, drinking wasn't just celebration, it was communion. Mead connected warriors to their ancestors, their gods, and occasionally the ground. They drank before battle for courage, after battle for amnesia, and in between for reasons no one wrote down because the ink was probably shaking too much. When the Roman Empire finally gave its last drunken toast to history, it left behind 3 enduring relics: crumbling roads, questionable water, and a hangover large enough to fill the Colosseum. From that wreckage, a new kind of hero stumbled into the light: the monk. They wore no armor, carried no sword, and waged no glorious wars. Instead, they turned divine boredom into chemistry, while the so-called barbarians shouted in mead halls and invented kingdoms with axes. The monks in silent stone cloisters were perfecting fermentation. Their monasteries, damp, cold, and endlessly patient, became laboratories of liquid faith. During fasting, when solid food was forbidden, but liquids mercifully weren't, they brewed a thick, cloudy drink that functioned somewhere between sustenance and revelation. They called it liquid bread. It wasn't just theology, it was theology you could sip. God above, yeast below, and an entire order of holy men learning that the road to enlightenment might actually be paved with barley. The early medieval beer wasn't the golden sparkle we know today. It was dense, yeasty, and so full of calories that drinking 3 mugs probably counted as a meal or confession. Each monastery had its own recipe, guarded with more secrecy than a king's treasury. The Benedictines chased malted sweetness, the Cistercians sought divine purity, and the Trappist, well, they discovered that waiting for fermentation was a spiritual exercise all its own. Beer was not merely a drink, it was divine economics. The monks sold it to pilgrims, peasants, and travelers in need of spiritual refreshment and mild inebriation. The church approved because, conveniently, drunk citizens made fewer heretics. Water spread disease. Beer spread docility. A win-win for both heaven and management. Historians now argue that without the monastic breweries, beer itself might have vanished after Rome, lost alongside plumbing and public hygiene. But the monks kept meticulous records, brewing logs more detailed than royal decrees, because salvation was important, but consistency even more so. So yes, while kings won crowns and knights won songs, the monks quietly won something far more enduring: the gratitude of every tired soul who ever lifted a mug and whispered, "Thank God for fermentation." And as monks brewed in candlelight, another ancient drink hummed softly across Europe: mead. That shimmering alchemy of honey and hope. Mead had existed since bees first realized they were accidentally creating joy. But in the Dark Ages, it became a small miracle in every cup, the sunlight you could swallow. In a time of mud, superstition, and famine, mead offered warmth, sweetness, and temporary amnesia. Simple to make, just honey, water, and reckless optimism, it became the drink of kings and farmers alike. The Norse called it the mead of poetry, claiming the gods themselves drank it to gain wisdom and the courage to sing terribly in public. Viking skalds turned it into verses. Peasants turned it into survival. Both ended up equally dizzy. A Viking feast wasn't judged by its food, but by how many horns of mead one could survive. Before making lifelong alliances with furniture, further south, mead sweetened weddings. Couples were gifted enough honey wine to last an entire moon cycle, hence the term honeymoon, which originally referred less to romance and more to strategic hydration. Even monks couldn't resist. They brewed it for medicine, cooking, diplomacy, and probably to make fasting less unbearable. It was clean, stable, and conveniently bless-able. By the 13th century, beer and wine began to overtake mead, but it never truly died. It lingered in folklore and feast, the golden ghost of Europe's earliest happiness, a reminder that not all progress moves forward. Sometimes civilization just refills the cup. When Islam swept across the Middle East in the 7th century, it brought with it a sober message. Alcohol was forbidden. The desert had seen too many drunken camel races, and someone finally decided humanity should try responsibility. Early caliphs enforced sobriety with the stern enthusiasm of men who had personally seen what hangovers could do. But empires expand faster than discipline. From Andalusia to Persia, old habits fermented quietly beneath the surface. Court poets wrote odes to divine love that sounded suspiciously like love letters to wine. They claimed it was all metaphor, though the slurred recitation suggested otherwise. No. Where did this holy hypocrisy bloom more beautifully than in Baghdad, the shining jewel of the Abbasid world, where philosophy, science, and discreet disobedience all drank from the same cup? Officially, the caliphs banned wine. Unofficially, their gardens flowed with suspiciously red fountains. The poet Abu Nuwas, patron saint of poetic mischief, filled entire manuscripts with verses about drinking beneath the stars. His words were so elegant that theologians debated for centuries whether he was inspired or just tipsy. Meanwhile, physicians prescribed wine for health. Sufi mystics used it as a symbol for divine ecstasy, and merchants quietly traded grapes behind mosques. The official religion was sobriety. The unofficial one was curiosity. By the 12th century, Muslim alchemists had refined distillation, creating early spirits that they carefully labeled as medicine because nothing says piety like a well-timed loophole. Ironically, the word alcohol itself comes from the Arabic alcohol, meaning the essence. The same civilization that banned drinking also named it. As the Islamic world mastered poetry and restraint, Europe did the opposite, inventing the tavern. It was democracy's noisy rehearsal room, smoky, sticky, and astonishingly alive. Taverns were the great social equalizers. Kings had courts, priests had cathedrals, and peasants had the pub, a place to drink, complain, and invent political philosophy before collapsing in the mud. The rules were simple: drink, sing, blame your problems on the king. Inside, floors were straw, air was smoke, and ambitions were liquid. Travelers found warmth, gossip, and an occasional brawl. Locals found therapy disguised as ale. Many taverns were run by alewives, women who brewed, sold, and managed the business with alarming efficiency. Their tools, cauldrons, cats, and broomsticks, later fueled Europe's witch imagery, proving that medieval sexism could turn entrepreneurship into witchcraft. Taverns also became the first political forums. Revolutions never began in palaces. They began wherever someone shouted, "You know what we should do." After their third monk, kings feared sedition, priests feared sin, and innkeepers feared running out of beer. But the tavern endured because trying to ban drinking in medieval Europe was like banning rain. You only made it wetter somewhere else. Stopped by the 15th century. The tavern was no longer just a building. It was Europe's heartbeat. Folk songs, gossip, conspiracies, and hygiene standards all began there. It was the world's first social network, only louder and stickier. As the Renaissance dawned, Europe traded superstition for reason, but not for sobriety. Philosophers debated astronomy, anatomy, and theology while half-drunk on mulled wine. Da Vinci sipped with restraint. Michelangelo preferred not to. Erasmus quipped that no one ever wrote well on an empty stomach or a dry throat. The printing press spread knowledge, but taverns spread opinion faster. Coffeehouses hadn't yet arrived, so ale remained the original Wi-Fi. Distilled spirits, sweet wines, and dubious tonics appeared across the continent, cures for everything except common sense. The age of exploration quickly became the age of exported alcoholism. Ships carried barrels of rum and brandy to every corner of the known world, ensuring that no civilization would remain sober for long. By the 17th century, Europe stood on the threshold of modernity, armed with logic, science, and a monumental thirst. Kings wrote decrees, scholars wrote treatises, and the rest of humanity raised their mugs to toast both. History, it seems, wasn't merely written by the victors. It was edited, and occasionally spilled, by the drunk. From the first fermented rice of China to the vineyards of Renaissance Tuscany, the human story has always smelled faintly of yeast. Invention built civilizations. Endurance kept them alive. But endurance, our ancestors discovered, was easier to swallow with a cup of something sweet, heady, and slightly dangerous. Fermentation was humanity's favorite form of hope. It was 41 BCE. Rome trembled after Caesar's assassination, a republic stitched together by ambition and betrayal. The so-called triumvirate ruled uneasily, 3 men pretending to share power, each secretly counting the days until he could have it all. Mark Antony, Rome's most magnetic general and least subtle politician, was sent east to steady the empire, but beyond the deserts and diplomacy waited someone far more formidable than any Senate decree. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, last of the Ptolemies, and master of spectacle. Antony ordered her to Tarsus, a summons meant to remind her that Egypt bent to Rome. Cleopatra, of course, did not bend. She arrived as a living myth. Her barge shimmered on the Cydnus River, its purple sails glowing like liquid dusk, its oars silver and silent. The scent of myrrh drifted across the water, and from afar it seemed that the goddess Isis herself had come to collect tribute. She reclined on a gilded couch beneath a canopy of gold, surrounded by servants who glittered like coins in candlelight. When Antony first saw her, the general became the captive. He had faced legions and conspiracies, but never this kind of warfare. The kind fought with perfume, laughter, and silence. Cleopatra understood power as theater. Antony, to his doom, adored a good show. That evening, she invited him to dine aboard her barge. The feast was a declaration disguised as seduction: roasted peacocks with jeweled feathers, golden goblets of wine so rich it seemed to hum, the Nile moon caught in their cups, and somewhere between politics and intoxication, empire began to blur with desire. But Cleopatra was no mere enchantress. Behind her smile was arithmetic. Egypt's throne was fragile, her alliance with Rome essential. Aligning herself with Antony, Caesar's successor in fame, if not in fortune, might secure her dynasty, and her son Caesarian's claim to the world's greatest name. Antony, for his part, saw in her both beauty and bankroll. Egypt's granaries were Rome's stomach, its gold Rome's appetite. Together, they could build something larger than either, or at least drink until they believed it so. The days that followed were honeyed and deliberate. Antony lingered in Alexandria, at first as guest, then as partner, and finally as something harder to define. Cleopatra challenged him as no Roman woman dared, witty, multilingual, and politically lethal. She debated philosophers in the morning, commanded fleets by noon, and mocked Roman prudery by dusk. To Antony, she was oxygen. Rome had caged him in duty. Cleopatra taught him to breathe again, extravagantly, dangerously, without permission. Together they founded the Inimitable Livers, a private club devoted to feast, laughter, and elaborate mischief. At night they disguised themselves and wandered Alexandria's alleys, drinking with sailors and teasing magistrates, living briefly as mortals rather than monarchs. The people adored them. The city thronged with rumor. Its queen was divine, its guest a god of chaos, but far away. In colder marble halls, another god was watching. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and the third member of that brittle triumvirate, collected every rumor of Antony's indulgence. Each banquet became a scandal, each kiss an act of treason. He painted Antony as Rome's fallen hero, bewitched by an Eastern witch whose eyeliner threatened civilization itself. Cleopatra was his weapon, and Antony's weakness. Yet Antony laughed off the whispers. He believed his victories could drown any slander. Cleopatra fed that confidence, offering ships, treasure, and soldiers for his campaigns. Together they forged not just an affair, but an alliance, a kingdom stitched from silk and strategy. In their minds, Alexandria was the new capital of the world. In Rome's, it was heresy with the harp. When Antony returned east in 37 BCE, the partnership had ripened into empire. Cleopatra greeted him with ceremonies so divine they seemed choreographed by the gods themselves. Dancers reenacted the sacred union of Isis and Osiris, proclaiming that their rulers were no longer merely human. Gold ceilings reflected candlelight like stars. Musicians played hymns older than language, and the air shimmered with the scent of lotus and ambition. The queen, radiant in lapis and linen, presented Antony not only with her affection, but with Egypt's vast treasury, wheat, silver, spice, and the illusion of immortality. For Antony, who dreamed of surpassing Caesar, it was irresistible. For Cleopatra, whose throne balanced on the edge of Roman politics, it was survival. Their love became the intersection of strategy and surrender, a romance scripted in wine and sealed in empire. The world beyond their walls whispered of decadence, but inside, they believed themselves eternal. History, of course, had other plans. Rome was already marching, sharpened by envy, clothed in righteousness. The tides of power were changing, but for one radiant moment on the Nile. Pleasure ruled the world. Because history, like wine, is a matter of fermentation. What begins as fruit and promise ends in intoxication and ruin. Cleopatra and Antony merely gave it a toast. Cleopatra did not woo Antony with roses or poetry. She offered him an empire, wrapped in gold and obligation. Her gifts were not sentimental, they were strategic. Ships carved from Lebanon cedar to bear his armies, archers drilled in the sands of the Nile, the undying loyalty of Egypt's vassal kings. She gave him instruments of conquest, not confession. In exchange, Antony returned the gesture on a map. He redrew the borders of the known world with his lover's name at the center: Cyprus, Crete, and the sun-bleached edges of Syria. Rome gasped. To them, its general had stopped serving the Republic and begun serving a queen. But for Antony and Cleopatra, this was theology disguised as politics. They crowned themselves the twin spirits of the East. He is the new Dionysus, god of wine and triumph. She is Isis reborn, mother of dynasties and storms. Together, they ruled from Alexandria, where sunlight turned marble to honey, and the Nile carried whispers more dangerous than armies. Rome might have called it decadence. To those who saw it firsthand, it was divinity rehearsing for eternity. Antony's Roman austerity began to melt. He traded his armor for silk, his Latin for the flowing vowels of Greek and Egyptian. The general became a priest of spectacle. In the palace overlooking the river, Cleopatra bore him twins, Alexander, Helios and Cleopatra Selene, children hailed as celestial heirs, sun and moon born of gods in human disguise. The city celebrated for weeks. Priests read omens in the smoke. Poets wrote hymns about a future where East and West would unite. And merchants whispered that even the river flowed slower to watch. Yet across the Mediterranean, marble men in colder rooms clenched their fist. The Senate's patience, already thin, snapped when Antony proclaimed the donations of Alexandria, granting entire territories to Cleopatra's children as if Rome's provinces were dowries. To the Senate, it was not love but treason. They muttered of witchcraft, of a queen who poured spells into her lover's wine. The Republic could tolerate lust, but not loyalty to another world still. Inside their perfumed palace, the lovers toasted eternity. Every night was a feast. Every feast a declaration that the future belonged to them. Alexandria glittered like a second Rome, except brighter, freer, less ashamed of its beauty. Scholars debated mathematics beside musicians, engineers dined with priests, and every conversation smelled faintly of lotus and ambition. Cleopatra's court was not merely luxurious. It was purposeful. She was rebuilding Egypt's soul, brick by scented brick, wrapping statecraft in incense and seduction. Antony, once a creature of iron and command, surrendered to the Egyptian rhythm. He still trained his legions, but their parades ended in banquets, their victories in music. Cleopatra joined him in armor, radiant beneath a silver diadem, her presence turning every military display into myth. They appeared before the crowds as Isis and Dionysus, rulers of life and revelry, presiding from golden thrones that caught the afternoon light like divine fire. For a moment, even time seemed to hesitate. But history is merciless to dreamers. Antony's grand campaigns eastward, his war against Parthia, meant to match Caesar's glory, crumbled into frost and starvation. The desert, that old enemy of empire, devoured his legions. Thousands died nameless among dunes and mountains, and the survivors limped home hollow-eyed. Rome watched and sharpened its knives. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, did not greet failure with reproach. She met Antony at the harbor with ships laden with grain and coin, her eyes unreadable. She rebuilt what the desert had destroyed, his armies, his pride, his will. Theirs was no longer a love of youth, but of necessity. A pact between two doomed deities determined to remain divine a little longer. Meanwhile, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, Antony's old ally, was weaving something deadlier than armies, a narrative. From his marble villa, he rewrote history in real time. Antony was no longer a hero. He was a slave to a foreign temptress. Cleopatra, no longer a monarch, became a serpent in silk. The Roman public adored such theater. Pamphlets spread like plague, depicting Antony as a drunken parody of himself, draped in gold, abandoning his Roman wife Octavia, conveniently Octavian's sister, for an Egyptian witch who claimed to birth gods. Rumors grew taller than temples. Some said Antony planned to move the capital to Alexandria, others that he would name Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as the rightful heir of Rome. To the superstitious Senate, it was proof enough. This was not politics, it was sorcery. Cleopatra laughed at first. Antony tried to. The laughter has a shorter lifespan than empire. Each whisper from Rome arrived like a small, invisible wound. Octavian's strategy was working. He didn't need to fight Antony's legions. He was corroding his reputation. Even Antony's allies began to waver. Senators avoiding his messengers. Old friends writing shorter letters. In Alexandria, the feast continued, louder, longer, a little more desperate. Antony paraded through the city in jeweled armor. Cleopatra smiled as if the world were still. But the music had changed. The notes carried unease. The Nile reflected not the gold of torches, but the shadow of something approaching, the slow, inevitable march of Rome. By 33 BCE, the illusion had cracked. The alliance between Octavian and Antony, once forged in Caesar's blood, shattered completely. Octavian claimed to defend the Republic from tyranny. Antony claimed to defend love from hypocrisy. Both were liars, and both were right. War was no longer a question. It was a calendar event. Octavian raised his armies and his propaganda in equal measure, promising to liberate Rome from its intoxicated general and the queen who had bewitched him. Antony still commanded legions, disciplined, loyal men who had seen him through storms and famine. But even soldiers can feel when history begins to withdraw its favor. Cleopatra urged him to strike first, to meet the tide before it reached their shores. But Antony hesitated. Between the marble of Rome and the gold of Egypt, he could no longer tell which world was home. And so the gods of wine and moonlight waited, unaware that empires, like lovers in intoxication, rarely end in fire. They drown quietly beneath their own reflection. Rome had forged him into discipline, and Egypt had turned him into divinity. Once, love had been their crown. Now it was their curse. Cleopatra ruled as a queen born to command. Antony still dreamed as a soldier born to obey. Their hearts beat to different wars. In 30 BCE, Octavian made his final, clever stroke. He did not name Antony as Rome's enemy. He named Cleopatra. By turning her into the face of corruption, he transformed civil war into a holy crusade. Rome would not be fighting its own blood, but purging itself of an Eastern temptation. In speeches and coins, Octavian spoke of order, reason, and Roman virtue. The enemy, he said, was not a general, but a seductress who had bewitched him, and thus, love itself became treason. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. The year was 31 BCE, the air heavy with prophecy and smoke from the forges. Their army was immense, legions hardened by conquest, fleets gleaming with bronze, treasuries emptied for one last gamble. To onlookers, it was a vision of might. To those within, it was a slow disintegration masked by gold and ritual. The soldiers toasted their commander's name, but whispered doubts in their tents. Were they defending Rome's honor, or one woman's ambition? Cleopatra arrived in her fleet, purple sails fluttering, prows gilded like the wings of divine birds. Her presence ignited awe and unease alike. Some called her a living goddess sent by Isis. Others muttered that she was Egypt's curse. dragging Antony into ruin. In councils, her voice was clear, commanding, imperial, but it clashed with the cautious murmurs of Roman tacticians. Antony himself stood at the fault line, torn between discipline and devotion. Meanwhile, Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, cut systematically through the Aegean, capturing harbors and isolating Antony's supply lines. The news tightened. Slow and inevitable. Cleopatra urged for a naval battle. Her now-trained captains believed in speed and the winds. Antony hesitated but yielded, as he always did, where her conviction met his fatigue. And so, the lovers prepared for their final war. When the dawn of September 2nd broke over the Gulf of Actium, the sea itself seemed reluctant to stir. Antony's ships were monstrous, their decks like fortresses, their movement painfully slow. Octavian's fleet danced in contrast, lean, quick, merciless. Cleopatra's flagship shone at the heart of it all, a golden flame upon a gray horizon. The clash came with the groan of wood and the hiss of fire. Flaming arrows rained down like judgments from the gods. Smoke rolled across the sea, swallowing the sunlight. Antony's ships fought stubbornly, but confusion ruled. From her vantage, Cleopatra watched the chaos, her eyes unreadable, her lips motionless. And then, the sails rose. Her fleet turned south. To some, it was fear. To others, premeditated escape. Perhaps she believed the battle already lost, or perhaps she hoped to preserve what remained. But Antony, seeing her standard vanish in the mist, broke. He abandoned command, boarded a small galley, and followed her. It was the moment his empire died. Leaderless, his men faltered. The proud Roman discipline dissolved into panic. Ships burned or splintered, bodies floated. By nightfall, the sea was a grave. When Antony finally found Cleopatra's vessel, silence was all that remained between them. The woman who had once ruled nations wept, and the man who had once ruled Rome stared into nothing. The gods had grown quiet. Even the sea seemed ashamed. They sailed back to Egypt beneath an indifferent sky. The waters that had once carried their triumphs now bore only ruin. Actium had not merely ended a battle. It had ended the illusion that love could defy empire. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra surrounded herself with incense and music, as if beauty could outlast despair. The city pretended to live while waiting to die. Markets still open, priests still chanted, and the sea still whispered against the harbor walls. But all knew Rome was coming. Antony, once the roaring lion of Rome, was now a shadow pacing his own cage. He drilled his few remaining soldiers, though even they knew it was for nothing. He ate little, spoke less, and slept like a man haunted not by ghost, but by memory. Cleopatra tried to summon the general he had been. She spoke of his victories, his legions, his name carved in marble. But Antony's eyes saw only the dust of 1,000 lost banners. Still, Cleopatra schemed. If war had failed, diplomacy might yet deceive. She sent emissaries to Octavian with gifts, gold, jewels, even promises. She asked only one thing, that her children be spared, and Egypt left unbroken. Octavian listened, politely, coldly. He admired her intellect, feared her influence, and planned her humiliation. In his eyes, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a trophy yet to be displayed in his triumphal parade. When Antony learned of her secret envoys, despair gave way to madness. He saw betrayal where there had once been devotion. Their love, once unbreakable, turned brittle with silence. The palace echoed with footsteps instead of laughter. Outside, the horizon burned. Octavian's legions had crossed the desert. The Nile Delta trembled under the weight of their march. Cleopatra ordered her fleet burned. Better ashes than surrender. The night sky turned crimson, reflecting the end of an age. When the final assault began, Alexandria shuddered. Antony, believing false news that Cleopatra was dead, fell upon his sword like the Roman he once was. But she lived, and when word reached him, he was already dying. His last command was simple: to be carried to her. And so they brought him, bleeding, broken, through the corridors of the palace, into the tomb she had built for herself. There, among gold and shadows, Cleopatra cradled him. He died whispering her name, as if it might outlast time itself. Octavian entered the city days later, victorious but uneasy. He found Cleopatra still regal even in mourning. He promised her mercy, but his mercy meant spectacle. He wished to parade her through Rome, caged and humiliated, as the final proof that even queens bow to empire. She smiled and agreed, and began to plan her last act. On August 12th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra, dressed in her royal robes, seated herself upon her throne and waited. At her feet lay a basket of figs, and within it, the asp, sacred serpent of Egypt. Its bite was both her weapon and her crown. When it struck, she did not scream. She simply closed her eyes, serene as marble, timeless as the Nile. When Octavian found her, he understood too late. He had conquered a nation, but lost a legend. With Cleopatra's death, the line of pharaohs ended. Egypt became Rome's province, but her story of power, pride, and defiance outlived every emperor who followed. Love had failed, empires had crumbled, but the myth endured, and sometimes that is victory enough. When Alexander chose Roxana, he believed love could be a form of conquest, a gentle empire built not on swords but on touch. She was Bactrian, proud and sharp, a woman whose beauty came laced with intelligence. Their marriage, celebrated in whispers and disbelief, symbolized his dream that East and West could one day lie together without violence. But dreams, like empires, are fragile things. Roxana adapted quickly. She was no passive ornament to the Macedonian crown. She learned the languages of her husband's generals, studied the gestures of power, and hid her fury beneath a diplomat's smile. She was loyal and possessive. To love Alexander was to share him, and she hated sharing anything. Yet she had rivals more ancient than politics. Among them was Hephaestion, the man who had fought beside Alexander from boyhood. The other half of his victories, the shadow at every feast. Where Roxana offered allure, Hephaestion offered memory. He had stood beside Alexander long before the throne, long before the empire, long before her. To challenge him was to challenge history itself. At banquets, foreign envoys sometimes addressed Hephaestion as another Alexander. They were not wrong. He was the king's reflection, his mirror, his temper, his solace. Roxana despised him for it. Her love became a private war, fought not with armies, but with glances and veiled words. She could win every argument, but never his past. The court noticed the tension. The generals whispered that their king, once the embodiment of Macedonian virtue, had grown too comfortable with Persian silk and scandal. Alexander heard them and ignored them. He refused to choose between the woman who completed his empire and the man who completed his soul. Then came the year 324 BCE. Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana and died, swiftly, inexplicably. Alexander was undone. He cut his hair, tore his robes, and ordered every temple in Babylon to honor Hephaestion as divine. No general, no wife, no conqueror in memory had ever mourned like this. Hephaestion's death was more than loss. It was dismemberment for Roxana. It was victory and defeat. She had won his body back, but the heart she gained was hollow. Alexander became restless, sleepless, a man chasing ghosts through corridors of incense and ambition. In grief, he built new empires to escape old pain. His sorrow turned outward, and soon into spectacle. He declared that the blood of Macedon and Persia must be joined not through war, but through marriage. At Susa, the ancient Persian capital, he staged a ceremony so vast it seemed the gods themselves attended. 90 of his officers married Persian noble women under golden canopies and clouds of frankincense. At the center of it all, Alexander took to brides himself, Cytera, the daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, child of Artaxerxes. Roxana, still his queen, was absent. To the Persians, it was unity. To the Macedonians, it was betrayal. Their lion had begun to wear the mask of the East. They watched their general kneel before a Persian princess, his robes heavy with embroidery, his crown shaped like theirs. The man who had once destroyed Persepolis now feasted among its heirs. Roxana seethed, silent but unyielding. She had given up her homeland, her family, her future, and now, even her title was being diluted into ceremony. But she understood her husband's mind too well to rage openly. Alexander believed himself divine, a bridge between nations, an empire made flesh. To question him was to challenge a god. And so she waited, patient as the blade she once danced with. The marriages at Susa were meant to weld the world together, but instead they cracked it. The soldiers who had followed Alexander across deserts now looked at him and saw not their king, but their conqueror. The dream of harmony had become a rumor of madness, and love, that delicate empire, had turned into something unrecognizable. Asterisk, the army began to whisper again. They said their king had gone too far, that the conqueror of Persia now worshipped its ghost. The final insult came one evening in Babylon, during a festival. In the midst of music and drunken applause, Alexander kissed a Persian courtier, Bagos, before the entire assembly. A gesture meant as affection was received as blasphemy. The Macedonian veterans stared in silence, unsure whether to cheer or weep. Their hero, their god, had become something they no longer understood. Some of his generals tried to reason with him. "You are a Greek king," they reminded. But Alexander no longer saw himself as Greek, nor as king. He had become an idea, one that believed it was immortal. He surrounded himself with mystics who called him the son of Zeus Ammon, the living axis of heaven and earth. To disagree was dangerous. Clytus the Black discovered that truth too late. A loyal friend and voice of reason, he spoke to honestly one night after too much wine. Alexander struck him down himself. The next morning, the king wept, but the damage was done by the time the army reached Babylon. The soldiers still worshipped him, but they no longer trusted the man behind the myth. He wore Persian robes, demanded Eastern ritual, and spoke of divine unity as though the gods were his peers. To them, he was no longer Macedonian, just another emperor drunk on his own eternity. Roxana saw it differently. She watched him drift farther from the mortal world, consumed by visions of empire that had no room left for love. When he fell ill in 323 BCE, she knew the world would soon collapse again. But this time, without him to rebuild it, the court split like glass under strain. Generals circled his bed like vultures dressed as mourners. The air smelled of myrrh and fear. And when the greatest conqueror finally stopped breathing, there was no silence, only calculation. Roxana moved first. She summoned Statera and Parisatis under the guise of peace. They came, veiled, cautious, and did not leave alive. Their names were erased, their graves unmarked. Roxana's unborn child, she declared, would inherit all that remained of Alexander. It was cruel, but necessary. In his world, mercy had always been another form of weakness. Her ruthlessness shocked the court, but no one dared challenge her. She was the mother of the heir, and that was a title even armies obeyed. Yet her triumph was hollow. She ruled among ghosts, Alexanders, Hephaestions, and now her own. The empire that once stretched from Greece to India was now collapsing under its own myth. Each general, each satrap, claimed a piece. The world Alexander had married together was divorcing itself by blood. Among the ruins of Susa, the women left behind by his great union mourned in silence. The Macedonian officers who had once married Persian brides now abandoned them without farewell. The so-called harmony between East and West dissolved into resentment and exile. Even in death, Alexander's dream refused peace. It decayed beautifully, like a tapestry unraveling thread by thread in the Persian courts. Whispers spread that the spirit of Statera haunted Babylon's palaces, a queen wed for empire, not for love. In Macedonia, soldiers muttered that their king had lost his soul to the east, and between them, Roxana, the last living link to his legend, clung to her child and to the ruins of a promise. Alexander had conquered the known world. Roxana had conquered what came after, and both found that the hardest empire to rule was always the one inside the human heart. The ghosts of Susa were not just the widows left behind or the royal daughters quietly erased. They were the fading echoes of an empire built on a dream too vast to survive its maker. Alexander's vision, that love could bind what conquest divided, had died with him. What lingered was the slow decay of faith and the cruel arithmetic of power. Roxana, once queen of the known world, became both sovereign and captive, a woman trapped in the golden cage of an empire that no longer believed in unity. Her only shield was the child she carried, Alexander IV, the last thread of legitimacy, a living reminder of the God King who had tried to turn the world into one family. Every general saw the boy as an opportunity, a crown to borrow, a symbol to exploit. They no longer feared Roxana herself, but the shadow her son's name cast across their ambitions. She knew this, and so she played the part of the grieving widow with exquisite precision, soft-spoken, obedient, harmless. Behind the mask, she maneuvered with the patience of a chess master, reminding all that her son's veins held both Macedonian steel and Persian gold. It was her last weapon, memory, and for a time, it kept them at bay. But loyalty in this new world was brittle as glass. Perdiccas, once her protector, fell to betrayal and blades, and with his death, Roxana's safety vanished. She and her son were taken to Macedonia, under protection, as the phrase went, but she knew a cage when she saw one. Cassander, cold-eyed and courteous, offered her safety with a serpent smile. Years passed behind palace walls, the boy growing under her whispered lessons of destiny and revenge. She told him of the man his father had been, the conqueror who dreamed of harmony and died for it. But she knew those stories were prayers to a dead god. When the boy reached youth, Cassander no longer needed myths. Quietly, efficiently, he erased the last heirs of Alexander's name. Mother and child disappeared into the hush of history. The empire they represented was already dust by then. Alexander had become legend, his body lost, his memory scattered like coins tossed to eternity. To the Persians, he remained the foreign deity who tried to weave their blood with that of Greece. To the Greeks, he was the hero who drowned glory in luxury. And to the soldiers who had followed him to the edge of the world, he was something in between, a man to human to be divine to be merely human. His lovers, too, turned to symbols. Roxana, the wildfire bride, came to embody passion, fierce, ungovernable, doomed. Statera, the daughter of Dryas, became the face of diplomacy and empire, the fragile marriage between conqueror and conquered. And Hephaestion, his mirror, his twin flame, remained the soul he could never outlive. Together they formed the trinity of his desire, the queen, the wife, and the companion. Later poets would say Alexander's heart conquered more than his armies ever could, and that his ruin began not in battle, but in love. Even centuries later, kings and emperors would chase his ghost, hoping to wield his empire, but fearing to share his fate. For what Alexander tried to join, love and power, the world itself refused to hold. Asterisk. His generals learned to late what their master's death had already taught. No empire born of one man's will can outlive him. The kingdoms they carved from his corpse flickered and died within decades, devoured by the same hunger that had once bound them together. The dream forged in fire at Susa's wedding halls dissolved into centuries of war. What Alexander had bound with passion, history would unbind with greed. Perhaps that was always his destiny. Men like Alexander were never meant to build peace, only to burn so brightly that even their ashes illuminated the ages. His loves were mirrors of his empire, radiant, impossible, and destined to collapse beneath their own grandeur. When his tomb was lost, it felt inevitable. He left behind no heirs, no peace, no grave certain enough to hold his legend, only brilliance, and the soft echo of those who had loved him into ruin. Centuries later, another empire rose, Rome. Its heartbeat was not love, but order. Its conquest not of hearts, but of time itself. A Roman day began not with sunlight, but with the iron cry of the tuba, the trumpet that split the dawn like a blade. Before the sun touched the tents, thousands of men stirred in perfect synchrony. Each soldier folded his cloak, checked his gear, and dismantled the fortress they had built the night before. No trace of camp, no scrap of waste. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To Rome, it was choreography. Breakfast was ritual, not comfort. Hard bread, cheese, watered wine. Then came the march. At a signal, the eagles were raised, and the legions moved as one living machine, their boots striking earth with the rhythm of thunder. The sound of empire was not battle. It was marching. Every man carried his world on his back armor, rations, tools, and memories. They were called Marius's mules, grumbling, sweating, enduring. Discipline was law. To fall out of line was to invite the lash, for Rome's strength was not courage, but obedience. When the day's march ended, the ritual began anew. Surveyors marked the ground, engineers drew lines in the dust, and the legions transformed wilderness into geometry. A new fortress rose before the stars appeared, identical to the one from the night before. In the rhythm of digging and hammering, Rome whispered its creed: order against chaos, discipline against time. Where Alexander had dreamed of unity through love, Rome built permanence through routine. Both sought eternity, but only one understood how cold eternity truly is. The Romans had a gift that bordered on sorcery: to take a wild, nameless piece of land and, before the sun had set, turn it into a city. At dusk, when other armies sought rest, the legions began to build. With the trumpet's call, thousands of men dropped their packs, took up shovels, axes, and iron picks, and bent the wilderness to geometry. Ditches, precise as lines drawn by a god's compass, were carved into the soil to meters deep, encircling the camp like a moat of discipline. The earth thrown from them rose inward, forming the rampart that would soon bear the wooden wall, the vallum, a crown of sharpened stakes, each driven into place by the hammer's rhythm of obedience. Every soldier knew his role. The engineers directed, the centurions enforced, and the legionaries worked in silence, broken only by command. Exhaustion was no excuse. A single lazy hand could invite death before morning. For the Romans, fatigue was a weakness that could kill thousands. Discipline was not cruelty. It was survival. Inside the ramparts, order reigned like religion. Streets were laid out at right angles, the Via Principalis dividing the camp as if drawn by divine law. At its heart rose the Praetorium, the general's tent, vast, draped in standards, its canvas glowing gold in the torchlight. There, beneath maps pinned with iron daggers, officers bent over the fate of empires, their shadows dancing on polished bronze as wine and war mixed freely. Around it stood the Principia, the administrative heart, part temple, part archive. Here, pay was counted, orders were written, and the legion's sacred standards were kept under constant guard. To lose one was a disgrace worse than death. To reclaim it could cleanse generations of shame. Beyond these sacred quarters stretched rows of tents, lined so perfectly that from above, the camp resembled a mosaic of stars. Each tent housed a contubernium, 8 men who marched, 8, fought, and slept as one. Here the world became smaller. Laughter round a small fire, smoke curling through the chill. The scent of boiled lentils, cheese, and oiled leather. In the dark, men joked about home, mended straps, polished shields, and let the clang of hammer on metal lull them into a soldier's peace. Dinner was humble: porridge, beans, a sliver of salted meat, and watered wine that tasted of iron and fatigue. Yet to men who had marched 20 miles and built a fortress by hand, it was enough. Each task followed the next with the precision of a heartbeat. Centurions walked between rows of tents, their shadows long, their voices measured. Engineers checked the gates, scribes recorded supplies, and torches were set at even distances, casting perfect amber symmetry across the camp. From the night sky, the Roman encampment looked celestial, a constellation of order, forged from exhaustion and will. Every night they built safety. Every dawn they would tear it down again. Within those walls, rest was ritual, not relief. Even peace had structure. To be Roman was to build civilization from soil, to hold chaos at bay. If only until the next morning's march. As the fires dimmed, the murmurs faded into ritual. Some soldiers whispered prayers to Mars, asking for courage and strength. Others spoke to quieter gods, household spirits of farms and kitchens, too far away to hear, but prayed anyway. Then came the silence, that heavy Roman silence, not of peace, but of readiness. Only the tread of centuries and the occasional call of an owl broke the stillness. For a legionary, rest was never safety. It was simply the hour between trumpet calls. The night belonged to the Vigilia Nocturnae, for watches dividing darkness into measured hours. Each man knew his turn, each centurion his duty. At the start of the first watch, tribunes inspected the guards stationed along the vallum. their torches reflecting off polished helmets and spearheads glinting like constellations. From their post, sentries stood motionless, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trench. Every man remained armed. Even a moment of carelessness could end in slaughter. Every 3 hours, the curved buccina sounded, a deep, mournful note marking the change of guard. One watch ended as the next began, the rhythm never breaking, the chain of vigilance never snapping. No gate was ever left unguarded. No soldier dared sleep. The penalty was death, swift, impersonal, and often at the hands of his peers. Discipline in Rome's armies was not cruelty. It was faith. The only faith that never failed them. Within the camp, soldiers slept in light slumber, wrapped in cloaks, shields stacked by their feet. Even in dreams, they were ready to kill. A single shout, signet ad arma, and the entire legion could rise within moments. Every man reaching for his weapon before he was fully awake. Beyond the palisades stretched wilderness, a dark world of wind, shadows, and rustling leaves. But within those wooden walls, there was only control. In that order, Rome found its strength, not in conquest, but in the power to master chaos, even in sleep, before dawn. The tuba sounded again. The illusion of rest ended. Men stirred, rolled their cloaks, and stamped out the embers of their fires. Every tent, stake, and cooking pot had its assigned bearer. Nothing was left behind. Even the ashes were buried, for Rome left no trace but perfection. Within an hour, the fortress that had protected 10,000 men was gone. Walls dismantled, ditches filled, gates reduced to timber and rope. The field returned to silence, save for the echo of marching feet. Each man carried nearly 30 kilograms on his back, armor, rations, tools, and the weight of Rome itself. Centurions inspected ranks with surgical precision, helmets aligned, straps tightened, sandals laced. To err was to die. Perfection was survival. Then came the omens. A priest raised his eyes to the sky, watching birds, smoke, and silence, reading meaning in every uncertain sign. Only when he nodded did the trumpet sound once more. And then they marched. Dust rose like incense behind them, standards gleamed with morning light, and the red tide of empire advanced again. Scouts cleared paths, engineers marked the roads, and the legions followed, a moving city of iron and breath. Wherever Rome went, civilization followed. They built as they conquered, measured the world with footsteps, and left behind only roads, straight as destiny, enduring as empire. In their wake followed more than conquest. They brought with them the rhythm of law, the cadence of commerce, and the austere music of the Latin tongue. Villages did not merely fear their coming. They stared in wonder, for Rome's terror lay not in savagery, but in symmetry, in legions that could slaughter by morning and raise temples by dusk. The march was relentless, an iron tide that refused to break. Under the white glare of the sun, helmets shimmered and armor grew hot enough to burn through cloth. Dust mingled with sweat until the soldiers wore the color of the road itself. Each breath stung of iron and earth. Still, the ranks did not falter. Centurions barked from within the column, their vine staves striking shoulders of those who lacked. To stumble was shame. To endure, sacred. Bridges were raised over rivers in a matter of hours, lashed from timber and roped by engineers whose hands have built half the known world. Rome did not wait for the land to yield. She commanded it to move. By late afternoon, heat rippled on the horizon like water. The sun burned low, and shadows stretched long across the fields. Yet even as fatigue crept in, the rhythm held. Soon the tuba would sound again, not to signal rest, but rebirth. Wherever the legion halted, a city of order would rise from wilderness. As the horizon swallowed the last light, the machine began again. Engineers rode ahead, mapping the next encampment with stakes and banners, each placement a note in the empire's silent hymn. Behind them came the soldiers, weary and wordless, hands already knowing what to do. They dug, they built, they fortified. Trenches scored the earth, palisades grew from nothing, and the glow of 100 campfires spread like veins of gold across the plain. Every hammer fall was a heartbeat of civilization. By nightfall, a new fortress stood, measured, symmetrical, alive. Officers gathered beneath the praetorium tent, eating from bronze plates, murmuring over maps as moths circled their lamps. Around the fires, soldiers laughed softly, gambling with dice, trading tales of faraway vineyards, of wives they might never see again. Yet even in these rare breaths of warmth, vigilance did not fade. Guards rotated their watch. Scouts melted into the dark. Centurions walked the lines like sentinels of an empire that refused to sleep from afar. The camp gleamed, a perfect square of light suspended in darkness, a geometry against the void. Every ditch, every wall, every footprint was a message carved into the soil. Rome imposes order upon chaos stopped by dawn. The trumpets would wail once more. The walls would fall, the fires would die, and the legion would march on. Behind them remained only the faint echo of design, a ghostly grid impressed upon the wild. For the Roman soldier, life was an endless pilgrimage between destruction and creation, between blood and symmetry. This was how Rome conquered, not only through the sword, but through repetition, through discipline made divine. The empire slept nowhere, because Rome herself never slept.